In the dark months of 1942, the mathematics of the Atlantic War pointed toward Allied defeat. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the combined shipyards of Britain, Canada, and the United States could replace them. The numbers were brutal and unforgiving. 6 million tons of shipping lost in 12 months, an average of 14 ships sent to the bottom every day. At this rate, Britain would starve. The American build-up in Europe would stall, and the entire Allied strategy for winning the war would collapse. The weapons to defeat Germany existed or were being developed. The soldiers and airmen to wield those weapons were being trained. But none of it mattered if the ships to carry everything across the Atlantic did not exist. The solution to this crisis would come not from admirals or generals, but from an industrialist who had never built a ship before the war began. Henry J. Kaiser was a construction magnate whose previous projects included the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, and major sections of the highway system. He knew nothing about shipbuilding traditions, naval architecture conventions, or the established practices of an industry that had operated the same way for generations. This ignorance would prove to be his greatest asset. Kaiser looked at the shipbuilding crisis and saw not an intractable problem, but an engineering challenge, one that could be solved by applying the same mass production techniques that had revolutionized American manufacturing. He was right, and his Liberty ships would become the weapons that won the Battle of the Atlantic. The Liberty ship design originated not in America, but in Britain. Facing a desperate shortage of merchant vessels in 1940, the British government had commissioned a simple utilitarian cargo ship that could be built quickly using available materials and skills. The design, based on an older British tramp steamer, emphasized ease of construction over elegance or efficiency. It was slow, barely 11 knots at full speed, and homely, with a profile that sailors would later describe as looking like an ugly duckling or a seagoing bathtub. But it could carry 10,000 tons of cargo across the Atlantic, and it could be built faster than anything that had come before. The Americans adopted the British design in early 1941, before Pearl Harbor brought them into the war as combatants. President Roosevelt, convinced that the defeat of Nazi Germany was essential to American security, authorized a massive expansion of merchant shipbuilding under the Lend-Lease program. The goal was to build enough ships to replace British losses and create a surplus that could support future offensive operations. The initial order was for 200 vessels, a number that seemed ambitious at the time. By the war's end, American yards would deliver over 2,700 Liberty ships plus hundreds of other vessel types in the greatest shipbuilding effort in human history. Kaiser entered the shipbuilding industry in 1941, establishing yards at Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon. He brought with him construction managers from his dam building days, men who were accustomed to massive projects, tight deadlines, and innovative problem-solving. They found an industry trapped in 19th century practices, building ships the same way their grandfathers had, using techniques that prioritize craftsmanship over speed. Traditional shipbuilding was an art form, with skilled workers fitting each piece individually, adjusting and modifying as they went. Kaiser and his team saw this as inefficient nonsense. They would build ships the way Ford built automobiles. The transformation began with prefabrication. Traditional shipyards constructed vessels piece by piece on the building ways, a process that required specialized workers to perform their tasks in sequence, each trade waiting for the previous one to finish. Kaiser's approach was radically different. The ship was divided into sections: deckhouses, bow assemblies, stern sections, hull segments, each of which could be constructed separately in workshops scattered across the yard. These sections were then transported to the building ways and assembled like components of a giant puzzle. Work that had previously been sequential became parallel. Tasks that had taken weeks now took days. The adoption of welding over riveting was equally revolutionary. Traditional ships were held together by millions of rivets, each one requiring a team of workers to heat, position, and hammer into place. Riveting was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and demanded skills that took years to develop. Welding was faster, required less skilled labor, and produced stronger joints when done correctly. The shipbuilding establishment resisted the change, warning of weld failures, metal fatigue, and catastrophic structural problems. Kaiser ignored them. His welders, many of them women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war, learned their trade in weeks rather than years and proved that welded ships could be built faster and sailed safely. The organization of labor in Kaiser's yards broke with every tradition of American industry. He recruited workers from across the country, housing them in company-built towns that surrounded the shipyards. He established training programs that transformed farm workers, shopkeepers, and housewives into shipbuilders in a matter of weeks. He hired women in numbers that shocked the traditional maritime industry, creating the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter. Though in Kaiser's yards, she was more likely to be Wendy the Welder. He provided on-site childcare, healthcare, and cafeterias, understanding that workers who were not worried about their families would be more productive workers. The social innovations were as significant as the technical ones. The results were unprecedented. A traditional shipyard might complete a Liberty ship in 8 months to a year. Kaiser's Richmond yards, by late 1942, were averaging 45 days from keel laying to delivery. The improvement continued as workers gained experience and processes were refined. In November 1942, Yard No. 2 at Richmond built the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. It was a publicity stunt designed to boost morale and demonstrate American industrial might, but it was also a genuine achievement, proof that the impossible had become possible. The 4-day ship was exceptional, but the routine production was nearly as impressive. By 1943, Kaiser's yards were launching a new ship every day. Across the country, other yards adopted his methods and approached his productivity. The combined output of American shipyards reached levels that had seemed fantastic just 2 years earlier. In 1943 alone, the United States built over 19 million tons of merchant shipping, more than 3 times what Germany managed to sink in the same period. The tonnage war, which had threatened to strangle the Allied cause, had been decisively reversed. Germany was no longer sinking ships faster than they could be built. America was building ships faster than they could possibly be sunk. The human effort behind these statistics was extraordinary. Shipyard workers labored around the clock in 3 shifts, 7 days a week, in conditions that would be considered intolerable by peacetime standards. The work was dangerous. Falls, burns, crushing injuries, and eye damage from welding arcs claimed casualties that the shipyards rarely publicized. The pace was relentless, with supervisors pushing for ever faster completion times and workers straining to meet quotas that seemed impossible until they were achieved. Many workers collapsed from exhaustion. Some died from accidents that might have been prevented with more rest and less pressure. The ships were built on a foundation of sacrifice that went largely unrecognized. The women who entered the shipyards transformed not only the industry, but American society. Before the war, heavy industrial work was exclusively male, protected by union rules, social conventions, and assumptions about female capabilities that were never tested because women were never allowed to try. The manpower shortage of wartime shattered these barriers. Women proved that they could weld, rivet, operate cranes, and perform every task that the yards required. They earned wages that had previously been reserved for men and gained economic independence that many would be reluctant to surrender when the war ended. The shipyards became incubators of social change that would bear fruit in the decades to come. The Liberty ships themselves, for all the ingenuity that went into their construction, remained simple and functional vessels. Their triple expansion steam engines were obsolete technology, chosen because they could be manufactured quickly by companies that lacked experience with more advanced propulsion systems. Their coal-fired boilers were inefficient compared to oil-burning alternatives, but coal was abundant, and the conversion would have slowed production. Their cargo handling equipment was basic, their accommodation spartan, their seakeeping abilities mediocre. They were not good ships in any traditional sense. They were adequate ships, built in quantities that transcended the limitations of individual vessels. The crews who sailed Liberty ships faced dangers that landside observers rarely appreciated. The vessels were slow, making them easy targets for submarines. Their thin hulls and welded construction made them vulnerable to torpedo damage that sturdier ships might survive. The explosive cargoes they often carried, ammunition, fuel, bombs, meant that a single hit could destroy a ship completely, leaving no survivors. The Atlantic crossing, which might take 2 weeks or more in convoy, was a continuous ordeal of anxiety, watchfulness, and the ever-present knowledge that death could come at any moment from beneath the waves. The casualty rate among merchant sailors was appalling. Over 9,000 American merchant mariners died during the war, a percentage loss rate that exceeded every branch of the military except the Marine Corps. They died in explosions and fires, from drowning and exposure, from injuries sustained when their ships broke apart around them. They died alone in the darkness of the Atlantic night, or in the company of shipmates who could not save them. And they died without the recognition accorded to military personnel, classified as civilians rather than servicemen, denied veterans' benefits, and often excluded from the honor rolls that commemorated the war dead. The Liberty ships were their coffins as often as their workplaces. Yet the ships kept coming, an endless procession of hulls sliding down the ways into waters that led to every theater of the war. Liberty ships carried tanks to North Africa and artillery to Italy, bombs to England, and food to the Soviet Union. They supplied the invasion of Normandy, the liberation of the Philippines, the occupation of Japan. They sailed in convoys of dozens, their identical silhouettes creating a uniformity that confused enemy targeters and simplified Allied logistics. They were torpedoed, bombed, mined, and kamikaze struck, and still they came, because America could build them faster than the enemy could sink them. The industrial effort required to produce Liberty ships extended far beyond the shipyards themselves. Steel mills worked overtime to produce the plate and structural members that formed the hulls. Engine factories manufactured power plants by the thousands. Pump companies, valve manufacturers, electrical suppliers, and hundreds of other firms contributed components that were assembled into finished vessels. The Liberty ship program was not a single project, but a network of interconnected efforts, coordinated by government agencies that had never attempted anything on this scale and managed by industrialists who were learning as they went. The logistics of this coordination would have been impossible without innovations in management and communication that paralleled the technical innovations in the yards. The Maritime Commission, under the leadership of Rear Admiral Emery Land, established standardized specifications, centralized procurement, and systematic allocation of materials that ensured components arrived where they were needed when they were needed. The Commission fought bureaucratic battles with the Army and Navy over material priorities, negotiated with unions over labor disputes, and pressured manufacturers who fell behind schedule. It was as much a combat organization as any unit that saw action, and its victories were measured in hulls launched rather than enemies defeated. The German response to the Liberty ship program evolved from dismissal to concern to something approaching despair. Early in the war, German naval planners assumed that submarine operations could outpace Allied construction indefinitely. The performance of American yards in 1941 and early 1942 seemed to support this assumption, with production lagging far behind losses. By late 1942, however, the acceleration of American output was becoming impossible to ignore. Intelligence reports reaching Berlin described shipyards operating at speeds that seemed incredible, production schedules that doubled and redoubled as methods improved. Dönitz and his staff recognized that the tonnage war was becoming unwinnable, that no achievable level of sinkings could overcome the industrial tide flowing from American yards. The strategic implications of Liberty ship production extended beyond the immediate crisis of the Atlantic War. The existence of a massive cargo fleet enabled offensive operations that would otherwise have been impossible. The invasion of North Africa in November 1942 required hundreds of ships to transport troops, equipment, and supplies across the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The invasion of Sicily and Italy consumed hundreds more. The build-up for D-Day, which would eventually land over 2 million men in France, depended on shipping capacity that could not have existed without the Liberty program. Every major operation of the war's later years was enabled by the industrial miracle that had occurred in American shipyards. The Liberty ship also represented a philosophical shift in American approaches to warfare. Traditional military thinking emphasized quality, the best weapons, the most skilled troops, the most advanced technology. The Liberty program demonstrated that quantity had a quality of its own, that overwhelming production could compensate for individual inferiority, that the race would go not to the swift, but to the prolific. This lesson would influence American strategy for decades, from the mass production of aircraft in World War II to the industrial logic of Cold War deterrence. The Liberty ship was not just a vessel, it was a proof of concept for a way of waging war. The end of hostilities left thousands of Liberty ships with no immediate purpose. Some were sold to private shipping companies, beginning second careers that would last decades. Others were placed in reserve fleets, anchored in coastal backwaters against the possibility of future need. Many were simply scrapped, their steel recycled into the consumer goods that powered post-war prosperity. A few survive today as museum ships, their utilitarian lines and cramped compartments testifying to an era when the fate of the world depended on how fast ships could be built. The legacy of the Liberty ship program extends beyond the vessels themselves. The techniques pioneered by Kaiser and his competitors transformed shipbuilding worldwide, establishing prefabrication and welding as standard practices that remain in use today. The social changes catalyzed by female participation in the workforce contributed to movements for gender equality that would reshape American society. The organizational innovations developed by the Maritime Commission influenced government management of large-scale projects for generations. The Liberty ship was a nexus of changes, a point where industrial, social, and organizational transformations converged to produce something greater than the sum of its parts. For the men and women who built the ships, the experience was defining in ways that peacetime work rarely matched. They had participated in something enormous, something consequential, something that mattered beyond their individual lives. They had worked alongside strangers who became comrades, had achieved goals that seemed impossible until they were achieved, had contributed to a victory that vindicated their sacrifices. The shipyard veterans, like the combat veterans, carried their experiences forward into peacetime, their identities shaped by what they had done during the years when everything was at stake. The sailors who crewed the Liberty ships carried a different burden. They had faced death repeatedly, had watched shipmates die, had survived experiences that those who remained ashore could never fully understand. Many struggled with what later generations would call post-traumatic stress, haunted by memories that refuse to fade. The lack of recognition for their service, the denial of veteran status, the exclusion from benefits, the civilian classification that seemed to diminish their sacrifices, added insult to injury. It would take decades for the merchant mariners of World War II to receive the acknowledgement they deserved. And by then, many had passed without ever seeing it. The simple mathematics of the Liberty Ship program tell a story of triumph against odds that seemed insurmountable. In 1942, it took an average of 244 days to build a Liberty ship. By 1943, the average had fallen to 42 days. By late 1944, some yards were completing ships in less than 30 days as routine production. The total output reached 2,710 vessels, plus hundreds of variants built on the same hull for specialized purposes. The collective tonnage was sufficient to supply armies, feed nations, and sustain the longest supply lines in military history. Against these numbers, the German submarine campaigns simply could not prevail. Dönitz had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons per month would be sufficient to defeat Britain. Even at the campaign's peak, his U-boats never reached that figure consistently, and by the time the Liberty ships were flowing in full volume, the target had become meaningless. The submarines could sink 500,000 tons per month, a catastrophic figure by any normal standard, and still fall further behind as American yards launched 600,000 tons of new construction. The arithmetic of attrition, which had favored Germany in the dark months of early 1942, had reversed completely by the end of the year. The Liberty ship was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It carried no guns capable of threatening an enemy fleet, launched no aircraft, fired no torpedoes. But it was as essential to victory as any battleship or bomber, because without it, the weapons of war could not reach the places where they were needed. The Liberty ship was infrastructure, logistics, the unsexy but indispensable foundation on which military operations depended. It was the corrective to the glamorous illusion that wars are won by heroic warriors rather than by the mundane machinery of supply. Henry Kaiser, the man who made it happen, became a national celebrity during the war, his name synonymous with American industrial might. He appeared on magazine covers, gave speeches, received awards, and was consulted by presidents. After the war, he turned his energy to other projects, automobiles, healthcare, real estate, with varying degrees of success. His shipyards closed or converted to other uses. The workers scattered to new jobs in a peacetime economy. The moment of extraordinary achievement passed into history, remembered by those who lived it, but increasingly distant from those who came after. Yet the achievement remains, documented in statistics, photographs, and the testimony of survivors. 2,710 ships, 4 years of relentless production, yards that launched a vessel every day that turned raw steel into finished ships in weeks rather than months, that employed hundreds of thousands of workers in an enterprise unprecedented in scale and unprecedented in consequence. The Liberty ships won no battles, earned no glory, attracted no the attention that flowed to combat forces, but they made victory possible in a way that no other single program matched. They were the margin between victory and defeat, the answer to a crisis that threatened to destroy everything the Allies were fighting for. The ocean that swallowed so many Liberty ships during the war holds them still. Their rusted hulls scattered across the Atlantic floor, their cargoes long dispersed, their crews long dead or aged beyond recognition. Some lie in shallow waters where divers can visit them, their structures colonized by marine life, their identities preserved in registries that record their names and fates. Others rest in depths that will never be explored. Unknown graves for unknown sailors who gave their lives carrying the supplies that won the war. They are monuments to an effort that deserves to be remembered, even as the details fade from living memory. The Battle of the Atlantic was won on many fronts, by codebreakers and scientists, by escorts and aircraft, by tactics and technology. But it was also won on the building ways of American shipyards, in the sparks of welding torches and the thunder of steel plates being moved into position, in the midnight shifts of tired workers and the calculations of production engineers. The Liberty Ship Program was the foundation on which all other efforts rested, the capacity that made everything else possible. Without it, the war would have been longer, harder, and perhaps unwinnable. With it, victory was assured by arithmetic, by the simple and overwhelming fact that America could build faster than Germany could destroy. 2,710 ships, built by workers who had never seen the ocean, sailed by crews who rarely came home to recognition, lost in numbers that would have been catastrophic in any previous war, and yet sufficient, more than sufficient, enough to drown the enemy in a tide of steel and cargo, enough to keep the lifelines open, enough to carry the armies and supplies that liberated a continent. The Liberty Ship miracle was not a miracle at all. It was the result of planning, innovation, effort, and sacrifice on a scale that had never been attempted before and has rarely been matched since. It was America at war, applying its industrial genius to a problem that demanded nothing less than everything. And it was enough.